It's not yet November 5th.
There's already been huge turnout.
But the 2024 presidential election is here.
Early voting is underway.
Tens of millions of Americans have already cast their ballots.
If Jimmy Carter can vote early, you can too.
And election clerks are operating under a microscope.
It's really important, and we prioritize security, integrity, and transparency.
As the next occupant of the White House is decided by you.
I feel it's my duty to do this because people died for the right to vote.
From the Fox 6 studios, this is Open Record. I'm Bryan Polcyn, and I'm here with Fox 6 political reporter Jason Calvi. Hey, Jason.
Hey, Brian.
We're getting close.
Almost there.
I can only imagine. You're still, I see the sweat already.
Need some more coffee.
Your face. Yeah. We are joined by a special guest this week, the former executive director of the City of Milwaukee Election Commission. It's Claire Woodall. Claire, thank you for being here on Open Record.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your first time to Fox 6 News.
It is my first time.
Well, welcome.
Usually Jason comes to me.
Yeah. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We are recording this episode on Wednesday, October 30th, 2024. As we record, we are officially 6 days away from the 2024 presidential election that pits Vice President Kamala Harris against former President Donald Trump. I say officially because the election is already well underway. Nearly 1 million Wisconsin residents have already cast their ballots. In-person early voting is way up from 2024 or in 2024. And we're going to talk about that as well as election security, how votes are counted, why trust in U.S. elections has eroded in recent years, and what a growing number of bipartisan organizations are doing to combat that. All of that and more when we come back after the break. Welcome back to Open Record. Claire Woodall is our guest, again, former elections commissioner in the city of Milwaukee, and you are now with an organization called Issue One. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that is and the purpose of it later, but here we are a few days away from the election. I mean, we're recording 6 days before. By the time this airs on Sunday night on Fox 6 News, it'll be 2 days before the election. But really, when I say before the election's here. It's happening, right? I mean, this is already, we're in the middle of the presidential election.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the moment that absentee ballots by mail went out, which is 6 weeks before the election, we really were in the thick of it. When you see the excitement, the chatter, and the misinformation starting to swirl.
When we looked at 2020 versus 2024, we saw a surge of people voting by absentee ballot in 2020. That was the pandemic going on. This year, we're seeing more people voting in person early. What do you think's driving those numbers of a surge of early voting?
I think it's actually just a continuation of the trend that we were seeing pre-pandemic. In 2016, we had a record number of early voters, at least in the city of Milwaukee. Each midterm grows. And in 2020, actually, it's overlooked a little bit, but Milwaukee had its highest in-person early voting turnout, in addition to the huge absentee. So across the nation, we see that people really like having the convenience of voting on their own time rather than leaving it up to just that one day. I have small kids. What if the stomach flu hits us all at once? You don't ever want to take that chance. And so I was going to wait until Election Day for my first time in a decade to vote. And then I just started getting nervous yesterday when I started thinking about it. So I think there's just that anticipation and just really the convenience of choosing when and where to go.
I follow up on that. I mean, if somebody does get the stomach flu on Election Day, how do they vote, or can they vote at all on Election Day if they're sick?
They could do a curbside ballot. That's what I would recommend so that they're not going into the polling place and spreading those germs. But curbside voting in Wisconsin is available at every polling place. You just give a call to either the number that's posted outside or to your clerk's office when you're there. But if you are listening to us right now, it is too late to do any early voting. There's absolutely no voting the day before the election on that Monday. So again, if you get called away to a business trip or something like that, you're going to have to move everything around in order to make sure that you can vote on Tuesday.
Just to be clear, this airs on Sunday night on Fox 6, but it will be released as an audio podcast and actually on YouTube and on Fox Local on Thursday.
Oh,
so
perfect.
at
then
that
those
time,
voters, if I've
you still have
scared
time. I just want to be clear. If you hear it on Thursday, you still have time because there's still early voting. Can't request a mail-in ballot. That deadline is long since passed.
That deadline the deadline actually, that is a very good point, is the deadline in Wisconsin to request an absentee ballot isn't until the Thursday before the election. But do not be fooled. It is too late to request a ballot get it in the mail and return it in the mail. That deadline has never been adjusted once we had the requirement that your ballot be received by Election Day.
And I
in
know
Wisconsin.
the Wisconsin Elections Commission now is telling people at this point, if you've still got an absentee ballot out, it's best just to bring it to your clerk at this point, because on Thursday it's potentially not going to get there, potentially not going to get to your clerk on Election Day. And so they're just warning, if it arrives after Election Day, you're not going to be able to count it.
That's correct. So if you're still holding on to your by mail ballot, I would strongly recommend that you take it either in person to your clerk's office, or if your community is using a drop box. That's one of the beauties of drop boxes, is during that last week, you have election officials checking those boxes and making sure that they are received on a daily basis, as opposed to putting it into the mail stream where it goes off to a central processing facility.
You said something interesting, though. You talk about how you were going to wait until Election Day for the first time and forever because you're not working the election directly. And so I'll just wait until Election Day like everybody else. And then you got nervous. And I've always been an Election Day voter. Partly as a journalist, I like to go in the morning, cast my ballot, and kind of sense what's the vibe. What are the lines? What do things look like? Do people seem nervous? I still remember 2008, people standing in long lines, the election of Barack Obama. I remember there was just a palpable nervousness in the air. It was really one of the more interesting experiences I've had at a polling place. But this year, I feel like I'm the procrastinator. I'm waiting until Election Day and everybody else has already done their chores. And I'm putting it until the end. Is it strange now that we live in a time when waiting until Election Day is almost feels like those are the procrastinators?
I mean, that's exactly how I felt yesterday, as everyone in my office had already voted, and not knowing what to expect, not being in charge of an election next Tuesday, but certainly still in the election world. I just started to feel like maybe I was the procrastinator and God forbid someone gets sick or there just be some other type of emergency. But I think that's the beauty of having a convenient voting system, is that you'll likely see less lines when you go vote, hopefully, if your community has also seen this trend in by mail and early voting, and your poll workers won't have quite that pressure added to them. So while you're procrastinating, your poll workers are still going to be so happy to see you on Election Day.
I guess this is the thing that makes me think about, though, is if Election Day, maybe there's a little pressure taken off because the lines aren't quite as long. It does mean there's been an expansion of this season when election clerks and administrators are having to work on administering an actual election for weeks instead of for one day. How has that changed running elections?
That is a really good point. I think when we started to see the expansion and growth of early voting, or in-person absentee is what I just call it, early voting for listeners, in 2016, we were really running two simultaneous elections. At that point, you could do early voting up until 6 weeks before the election. And so in Milwaukee, we had 6 weeks of early voting, and then we had Election Day. And by mail voting wasn't quite as popular, but that's really changed since the pandemic, where you're really always running 3 elections at once. Your by mail operation starts 6 weeks before the general, and then you're doing all the preparation, staffing, and planning for early voting. That's happening in those 2 weeks before the election. But you can't neglect Election Day, because that is when the very last minute, if you have long lines, you might really be deterring someone from waiting in that line. So I think election administration has become quite a more complicated event to plan. I used to say I was the city's largest event planner, but it's really planning those 3 really large, highly technical, very detailed events.
And with all of these absentee ballots, whether in person or by mail, now coming to clerks around the state, and I mean, we talked about, I asked that first question, why the surge in in-person voting? I know Republicans really getting on board this time and really encouraging, conservative radio encouraging their voters or their listeners to vote early. What's this going to mean for the counting of the ballots? I mean, these things take a lot longer to open and process, right? And you can't start counting until the polls open at 7 a.m. on Election Day.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think what we might see is in these communities that previously, especially in 2020, when the Trump campaign was discouraging people from voting early and encouraging Election Day, you're going to see a learning curve, because in communities that don't use a central count processing center, your poll workers are in charge of both serving you, the in-person voter, on Election Day, but they also have to be running the processing of those absentee ballots at the polling place as well. So I know that clerks have been preparing for this. We're the constant worriers and planners, but it's going to be, I think, a little bit of a learning curve where maybe once the lines have ended at 8 p.m. or a little bit after, you still have some polling places that are still trying to catch up with processing all of those early votes. So we'll see. I'm confident the places that use central count, they do it because of how accurate, efficient, and consistent it is, where you have all of the ballots in one place. They're being treated all the same with all of the same rules. You have a centralized location to be asking your election officials questions. And so I'm confident that those communities, they are used to doing high volumes. And I think that we're going to see their results be very consistent with what we've seen before, which is probably around midnight for Milwaukee. But I think the bigger learning curve will be for the polling places who are facing an increase in these early voters and communities that usually don't see the volumes.
Thinking about, you talked about the midnight roughly when those will come in, because it takes a long time to count absentee ballots that you can't, as you said, Jason, start until the polls open on election day. And I guess on the one hand, I understand why. If you start counting ballots early and you get an idea of who's in the lead and that information leaks out, maybe it affects how people will vote. I don't know if that's part of the reasoning behind it or not. But is there a handicap in having to wait when there's such a high volume of absentee voting to have to wait until election day to start counting, that we end up getting these really late night totals that can, especially in larger cities like Milwaukee or in Dane County, can shift where things look like they're headed and feed the narrative of those who are concerned that an election is being stolen?
It is just a narrative, and it is the misinformation. And we were really hopeful. We almost got it passed to allow us to do Monday processing of absentee ballots. There was bipartisan support, but unfortunately, conspiracy theories took hold about us knowing the results the day before. Even though, I don't know if you remember, but in the April 2020 election, we, across the state, had to delay having any results for a whole week in order to have all the by-mail ballots arrive, and there was absolutely no leak. We are one of only, I think, 13 states that don't allow any pre-processing of an absentee ballot. And when we say pre-processing, you can't be reviewing it for the signatures. You can't be opening and flattening the ballots. You would not believe how much help it would be if we could be stacking those ballots
It's
and
manual
getting
labor.
them flat.
It's just physical manual labor,
It's just
right?
physical manual labor, but it's a very detailed process. So, you see Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, not only are we swing states, but we're also subject to all of these conspiracy theories because of state statutes tying our hands. Other states allow you to process some version, whether it's putting it through a machine or not, either weeks before the election or at least within the week of the election.
I do want to ask, though, and I'm sorry, Jason, you probably got a million questions, but along those lines, if the states that do allow the pre-counting, because so many more people are starting to vote early or vote absentee, and we're seeing these growing numbers all across the country, we are hearing places that are starting to tell us, well, in this place, Republicans are ahead this many percent of where they were before. Are we starting to get, or is that actual counting of ballots? Or is that looking at where those mail-in ballots are coming from and making guesses and estimates based upon previous voting patterns?
That's a really good question. So in many states, when you register to vote, you designate a political party or you register as unaffiliated. So those numbers are based on someone's affiliation with a party. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to vote that way, but it's because they have a closed primary system. So you can only vote in the party's primary that you're registered for. In Wisconsin, you don't ever tell your clerk when you fill out your voter registration form, your party affiliation. So when you're seeing those numbers, it's just projections. I think it can be very dangerous when we hear that some places are up because we don't know how those people are voting. And I think it's where a lot of times polls do end up getting it wrong, or at least these projections. And yeah. So does that answer your question? It's not, we're not getting, in no state can you start to tabulate and get the results prior to election day.
I do know that there's a lot of people out there with a lot of money and a lot of data power who are trying to figure these things out, but they're finding ways to say, can we predict, and whether those are accurate or not is the big question, right?
Yeah, exactly. And what I wanted to get in here was the process. So what's going to be happening at all of these places that are counting the absentee ballots? First, you have to open up the outer envelope. How many workers are looking at that ballot? I mean, just kind of walk us through that whole process.
Yeah, so I think this, once you learn how detailed it is and that you can return your absentee ballot up until 8 p.m. on election day in Wisconsin, I think you start to see and understand why it takes a little bit longer than 9 o'clock to get those results. With every ballot that comes in, first it is scanned into the statewide database so that you can go to myvote.wi.gov to check to make sure and have peace of mind that your clerk received your ballot. Then that ballot's going to be sorted by ward. The city of Milwaukee has 354 wards. And then that ballot is going to get alphabetized because on election day, every single absentee ballot envelope is going to get assigned a voter number in the absentee log or in the poll book if it's being processed at the polls, just like when you go to vote on election day. And so then that is all that you can do prior to election day as a clerk. You can scan the ballot in and you can sort it by ward and then alphabetize it. On election day, teams of 2 poll workers at all times. You cannot do anything at the table with a live ballot if you don't have 2 poll workers. But a team of 2 is going to review that certificate envelope. They're going to check for a voter signature, a witness signature, and a witness address. And then they are going to, everyone's process differs a little bit, but they'll open the ballot. They're going to assign a voter number either in the poll book or in the absentee log if it's a central count facility. And they're also going to write that number on the envelope itself. Then that ballot is going to get put into the pile, and you're going to continue to do that for every single voter in that ward. At the conclusion of that, then those ballots, any that were emailed. So if you are overseas or you're in the military, you're able to receive your ballot via email. They have to print it out and then mail it back into the clerk. Those ballots need to be reconstructed onto an official ballot. So that the same team of 2 would take that ballot. They have extensive detailed paperwork where they record that voter number, that it's being reconstructed, why it's being reconstructed. And as a team of 2, they're going to reconstruct that ballot to make sure it matches what the voter wanted. Any ballots that were damaged, that got torn, ripped in the mail, coffee spilled on them. We see all sorts of things, blood on them. If they don't think that
happening.
If they don't think that that can go through the machine, then those will also get reconstructed. So at that point, ballots are then fed through a machine, either in the polling place or a lot of the central count municipalities have these high-speed tabulators. Those are still done by ward, and then anything that the machine can't read gets reviewed. And some examples of why you wouldn't be able to read it is if someone voted for 2 candidates and then marked out one and wrote an arrow and said this one. Every single time that happens, that gets reconstructed. The entire ballot gets reconstructed onto a new ballot to make sure that their votes are counted as the voter intended. And that's always done in a team of 2. And in these larger cities, usually bipartisan teams of 2, where the political parties have been really good about nominating election workers from both parties to be present and working at central count.
And that during that reconstruction process, there's also election observers as well, watching as well from both parties, outside groups, et cetera.
Yeah, so this whole process is always open to election observers. And I've learned working in the national sphere how lucky we are, I think, to have such transparent election laws that anyone can go and observe at the polling place or at central count or during early voting, the process. You don't have to be affiliated with the party. You don't have to pre-register. And that's not the case in every state. But all of this is done under the observation within 3 to 8 feet of observers. And I can assure you that at Milwaukee's central count, we don't lack observers. I think we had just as many observers in 2022 as we did election workers.
I want to talk more about election security because that's a really big question right now. It's a really big topic. We're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about how the people in charge are making sure your vote counts just the way it's supposed to. We'll do that after the break. Welcome back to Open Record. We are here with Claire Woodall, former election commissioner in the city of Milwaukee, now with an organization called Issue One. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit, but let's talk about election security because there's been so much attention focused on whether or not our elections are secure. And we obviously know after the 2020 election, there were a number of lawsuits filed by the Trump administration here in the state of Wisconsin. I think there were 8. Some states, Pennsylvania, as many as 12. None of them actually landed. None of them actually found any particular wrongdoing, but certainly there's been a lot of challenges in a number of directions. I guess I'd step back for a minute for the voters, for the people who are watching. how can you assure them that their ballot will be counted and won't be diluted by someone else's fraud or someone else's mistake?
Ooh, how would your ballot be diluted by someone else's fraud? I guess it would be my first question.
I think the allegation that's out there is that when there's if there is a lot of fraud in the system, that now my vote counts less.
Counts
right?
less.
Yeah,
Got it.
My vote has been diluted that way.
I think that I told you that election officials are like the constant worriers. The beauty of the election system in America, and this I see it in every single state, even though the laws are different, is that we set up every single system to have multiple points where errors are detected. So that if, for instance, we saw at the very beginning of the voting period, in Madison, where voters were getting duplicate ballots, but that's caught. That would be caught when I described that process of ballots immediately getting checked into the WISVOTE system. You can only record one ballot. And so it would be caught, you would get an error screen and you'd go, oh, wow, what happened here? And then if we hadn't been informed by the public that they had gotten two ballots, it would have immediately been caught, and you would never have two ballots counted for one voter, because each voter, when I talk about that, only gets one voter number. You can't get two voter numbers when you're processing those ballots. So I think the system is set up to have multiple checks and balances. When it comes to these allegations of like non-citizens voting or the database being fraught with errors, the state of Wisconsin participates in what is called ERIC. It's the Electronic Registration Information Center, which, while it's been villainized since 2020, we actually joined under the GOP direction of the state legislature. And it's a great system that provides information sharing of voter registration lists across states. So we're not only comparing within our state to make sure someone only has one voter registration record and is only voting once, but it extends to all the states that are participating.
How many states are a part of that?
I think right now, I want to say 23, which it has seen a drop since 2020 because of these conspiracy theories. But really, it was the most effective way to have a national system that would ensure that our voting rolls were accurate. Every time you register to vote, your name, your date of birth, and your ID gets checked. It's called a HAVA check. It came out of the Help America Vote Act, and that's confirming that you are a valid U.S. citizen. And if it comes back as a mismatch, you get a letter letting you know that it came back as a mismatch. Let's double check and see what's going on with your ID. So there's lots of systems in place. In my time as the election commission director in Milwaukee, the thing that we would see is occasionally we would see after the election, someone died, but in those weeks leading up to the election, but had already returned their ballot. These are one-off errors where it's not affecting the outcome of elections. And if it was, I can assure you that if someone's voting twice, it would be front and center. Just this past spring, we accidentally issued an absentee ballot at early voting to a man with a very common name, and it was the wrong one. They caught it at early voting, but they didn't cancel his ballot. So he goes to the polls, shows up to vote, and we say, oh, we already issued you an early voting ballot. So before he could even call me, he was on talk radio talking about it. But then we sorted it out. We learned, oh no, and then I can see in the system where they immediately corrected it for the voter who was present, but they didn't cancel that in the system. So we were able to sort it out within 15 minutes, figure out that it was an inadvertent database error, and he was able to vote. So when we hear these things about voter fraud, people going and voting on others' behalf, it's just not true, because you would hear, especially in this day and age of Twitter, widespread reports of I went to vote and they said I already voted, things like that.
Jason?
You mentioned if somebody dies. So we've got so many people voting early. What happens if in that 2 weeks before Election Day someone dies? Is their vote still able to be counted? They voted in October.
No, so you have to still be alive on Election Day to have your vote counted. Now, we have a statewide voter database, and that the state gets reports from DHHS on a monthly basis. So it's good timing, because it will come actually this week, of who has passed away in Wisconsin, and it's matched within the voter registration database. So clerks, one of the steps pre-election is to be processing your alerts and pulling any ballots of anyone who's become ineligible to vote. So that's one of the last steps I used to do the weekend before the election, was making sure that we went through and flagged and pulled anyone who may have voted before election day. That's how detailed these processes are.
Well, and it seems like a new thing that you wouldn't have had to deal with maybe in years past, or at least not on this scale, when you had to have a particular reason to vote absentee. You were going to be absent from the municipality. You had, your military service. Now, because anyone can vote absentee for any reason in the state, and it's been this way since we established 1999. So 25 years, you've been able to vote for any reason early. When you have this kind of a volume, I think it increases the odds that someone may pass away, or someone may be convicted of a felony and lose their voting rights. Are those things that you have to now check for at scale leading up to an election?
No, so they were things that were always occurring. And I would argue that if someone passes away, the likelihood of their need to use an absentee ballot existed before 1999, because they're usually sick or having trouble getting to a polling place. Not always, but most of the time. So this is something that the volume of people who are passing away or being convicted of felonies right before an election hasn't changed.
No, but the volume of people who are early voting, right?
And so, but you're going through. So this is something I think you should know. This has been a long established practice. Clerks have always been going through those lists, and the system within the database, it's not any greater amount of work because the database is matching them to go through those.
In how many cases would you say on average there would have been of somebody dying after they cast an absentee ballot and then before election day?
It's very low. I want to say in the city of Milwaukee, which had 247,000 voters in 2020. I recall that happening twice.
So it's rare.
Very
happens,
rare.
But it's rare. Okay. A big question when it comes to election security has often, and we know wrongfully so, been targeted at the voting machines themselves and whether they can be hacked. I know that one of the things that I learned last time around in the process of this is during the day, these election machines that have Wi-Fi transmission capabilities are actually disconnected. They're not connected to the internet during the voting process. Is that right?
That's correct.
And obviously that is one of the reasons. Can you talk a little bit about the security of the machines themselves and the concerns that have been raised about that?
So the machines themselves are never hardwired to any internet connection ever. The machines have encrypted flash drives that go in them with the programming, and then those are tested before each election, and so is the private modeming. So they do have a private cellular network that they modem over to send their results to each county's secure server. That is not active at all during the day. You have to activate it, and it is not something that has ever been hacked. It's not just your run-of-the-mill Wi-Fi. It's over a secure encrypted cellular data that only those election offices, only their data is going through those, is my understanding.
And if somehow, because I always figure there's someone smarter out there who can figure this stuff out, if somehow you still have the paper ballots.
Yes, so you
that
still
are the
have
ultimate record, right?
You have the paper ballots, and what I think a lot of people don't realize is, with or without a recount, after every single general election, the state election commission selects randomly different communities, different voting precincts to be audited with a hand count to make sure that the machines tallied the votes correctly. And everyone can relax. The city of Milwaukee is automatically included every time because of their size. And at least 7 wards are selected. So then you have human election workers going through. This process is completely open to observers, and they do a hand count of those wards' ballots and compare it. It takes a lot longer because of human error. Someone comes in, they interrupt you. You start to lose your train of thought, and then you go, "Oh, did I mark that tally mark when my partner read it aloud?" The machines don't have those interruptions, and so they're extremely accurate. And the hand counts that happen after every single general election continue to show how accurate the machines are. In each recount, if there had been hacking, we would have an indication of that. And again, the recount after recount shows how accurate the machines are.
When you talked about the encrypted memory drive that you have, I mean, one of the scenes from 2020 was you getting in the police escort with that secure drive, taking it over to the county courthouse. What was the journey like in that police motorcade? I guess with the police escorting you to the courthouse. Were you listening to the radio? Did you catch your breath? What happens in that police car?
Oh, first, I'll start off by why you're in that police car. Is the high-speed tabulators that I mentioned that are used at central counts, they don't have any type of modeming capabilities whatsoever. They don't connect to a private cellular network. They have no ability to be hooked up to the internet. So that's why those flash drives have to actually be transported to the county. Honestly, it was 3:00 in the morning. I was 12 weeks pregnant. I, for the past month, had been trying to decipher whether it was anxiety and stress or morning sickness. And so my memory is that it was just very quiet. I sat in the front seat. He had his police radio on. There was no tunes, but it was all of, I think, about an 8-block journey as well. I think there was more debate about when to get me out of the car and go into the courthouse. I think we were parked outside the courthouse longer than it took for us to drive there.
The central count tabulators, you said. So when we're talking about central count, that's where all the absentee ballots go for municipalities like Milwaukee. And those tabulators, those high-speed tabulators, are not connected at all.
Not at all.
So it all has to be on a flash drive.
On a flash drive to program the machine, to export the results. There's just absolutely no connectivity on those machines.
Yeah, it was 3 a.m, that ride over to the courthouse.
It was, I think, 3:30.
You mentioned earlier in our discussion, you think that we might have counting done by midnight. So how are we going to get done more quickly this time around?
That's a great question. So when we went through that whole process of what happens when an absentee ballot is returned before it's counted, in 2020, it was the first year that the city of Milwaukee had multiple drop box locations, and we wanted to maximize voters' time to return their ballot, so we kept them open until 7:30. Between 6 o'clock and 7:30, or really between 6 o'clock and 8 p.m., because people were also able to drop off at Central Count, we received over 1,000 ballots. So you're not procrastinating, Brian, because there's lots of people who procrastinate longer
so
than
I went
you.
in the morning. I'm actually on top of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what happens is those ballots are all valid, but they have to be sorted. They have to be scanned into the database. They have to then you pick up from the last voter number in that ward. You record their voter number. You record it in 3 spots. And then that ballot gets taken up and put through the tabulator. Again, 354 wards and over 1,000 ballots were received between 6 and 8 p.m. So it just really slowed us down. So I know that in the city of Milwaukee, they're closing the drop boxes. I believe it's 6:30 this time, or is it 6? Oh gosh, I want to double check that. But they are closing them earlier. And we are being very vocal to voters about don't wait till the last minute to turn in your ballot. And so I don't think we're going to see that delay. In 2020, we also had 400 election workers, at least 75% of whom were doing this for the very first time. That has changed. We've continued to need more central count workers, continued to train and retained those workers who were there in 2020. So they'll also be more experienced with the process.
All right. I don't want to run out of time to talk about the organization you're a part of now, Issue 1. So we're going to take a break. One of the things we're really surrounded by as we talk about all this is trust in elections, trust in whether or not your vote and the results of these elections are legitimate, something maybe we didn't have much concern about in the past, but is certainly a chief concern right now. We're going to talk more about Issue 1 when we come right back. Welcome back to Open Record. Again, we are joined by Claire Woodall, who is the former election commissioner in the city of Milwaukee. You are now with an organization called Issue 1. It is a nonprofit. Is it nonpartisan, bipartisan? I don't know the right way to put that, but you are an organization that's focused on trust in elections. Is that right?
That's correct. And we are a nonprofit that works, they're based in Washington, D.C. They work very closely with the House of Representatives and your senators to institute common sense bipartisan legislation to support election administration. So we do have a lot of bipartisan support. And we have a National Council on Election Integrity, which is from former members of Congress, and are very active in making sure that election administrators have the resources and support that they need, whether it's advocating for federal funding, but also monitoring the misinformation, the narratives online, and really helping them combat all of this misinformation.
I was kind of researching a little bit about your group, and I came across, I told you, I nerded out. I ended up watching a C-SPAN video of CEO Nick Penniman. Is that right?
That's right.
Is the CEO of Issue 1. He talked, and on the one hand, I started listening to him talk, and he's very critical of the Trump administration in 2020 and the lawsuits that were filed, challenging elections and the results all over, including right here in Wisconsin. 8 lawsuits filed in Wisconsin. None of them made it to trial. None of them made it even that far. In fact, of the 60 lawsuits, none of them had evidence that were deemed to be worthy of a trial. But then he started talking about other aspects of election integrity, and one of them was voter ID. So if you on the one hand, you might go, okay, well, that sounds like someone who's just anti-Trump, and I imagine people watching this going, he's just a big lefty. And then on the other hand, he turns around and says, I think every state should have voter ID. And you go, wait a minute, that's like a swing coming from the other side. So he was talking about the importance of voter ID. As someone who has run elections, how important is voter ID to that piece of making sure that the person who is coming to vote is the person they say they are?
I think that voter ID is important, not necessarily because we have people impersonating other voters, but because voters feel more confident in the process. And time again, we see voter ID instills confidence in the process. And so why are we still, years and years after in Wisconsin implementing a photo ID law, criticizing it instead of just being completely against it? I think in Wisconsin, there's improvements that need to be made to the voter ID law. You can't use an out-of-state license. In order to use a student ID, it has to have ridiculous requirements that are unlike any other of the ID requirements. So as a former election administrator, I am not at all opposed to voter ID, but we need common sense voter ID laws that aren't disenfranchising voters who may have just moved here, or students who might not know that you need a second ID of a student ID in order to vote.
When you talk about boosting confidence in the elections after what we saw in 2020, what have you learned from 2020? What are you really focusing on right now? You mentioned a lot of misinformation out there. What are you focusing on right now to kind of boost that confidence?
I think the thing that we're working on at Issue 1 the most is just helping the public understand how elections work. So we have, if you go to howelectionswork.org, it's a nonpartisan website where you can learn about all of the information all of the process that happens pre-election, on election day, and post-election, all the way up through certification. We have state-specific guides for the swing states. And then we have where you can get connected directly to your state's election official. Because what we see is that people are getting information from the different political parties. They're getting it from different groups online. They're not getting it directly from the source, which is the election officials. Which, imagine if you were going to, your political party to get information about medical information. I describe how this must be how doctors felt with the emergence of the internet and Google, is how election administrators have felt over the past 4 years, of people who think they understand a process, but they're misunderstanding critical parts that are protecting the security of the process.
I know one of the things your organization has talked a lot about is federal funding of elections. Can you talk about why that's important and why that actually may help to achieve greater trust in election security?
Yeah, so when we talk about election security and federal funding, it's important to know that equipment is expensive. I was just reading about yesterday long lines in Pennsylvania, and that it takes 10 to 12 minutes per voter when they're doing their in-person absentee voting. And a center shut down for 45 minutes because their ballot on demand printer had some type of error. That printer cost $7,000. So while you might think, you should automatically have a backup, multiply that by, in Milwaukee, we have 15 early voting sites. Or if you start to look at the number of polling places and the population size, it's very expensive to run elections. And we want to make sure that the technology and equipment is always up to date to really counter any of the emerging cyber issues, emerging threats to elections. But it is extremely expensive. And I faced this as an election administrator. The last thing that people want to invest in a great deal every year is election administration. They go, oh, what do you do the other 3 years when you're not running a presidential election? I think people take for granted that it's not a one-day job. It is something that you're constantly doing, all the contingency planning, the voter list maintenance. But it's the same way nationwide. And so we need federal funding. In 2016, after there was cyber interference with our elections, our election administration was deemed critical infrastructure. We have not seen consistent funding since the federal government deemed elections critical infrastructure, even though we've endured a pandemic where elections still continued in the midst of a global pandemic. So I think states, but also local governments need a federal funding stream because every local government has different needs, whether it's early voting, whether it's supporting drop boxes because you have a lot of workers who work a certain shift that makes it hard for them to come in and do early voting, things like that.
One of the resources that you're also looking at as people, when you look at the poll workers, the average age of a poll worker, 56% are over the age of 61. Is this sustainable?
Well, that's the way it's always been. And actually, the age dropped after the pandemic. So one great thing that came out of 2020 was because our older population was so susceptible to COVID-19, there was a lot of fear and a lot of precaution taken. We saw a younger generation really step up. And that was one of the best things that came out of 2020 here in Milwaukee was you started to see more people taking off of work to work at the polls, more college students wanting to get involved in the process. So I don't know what the exact, is that a national statistic or a state statistic?
I will say, I think that came from, that actually was a 2016 statistic. So it's outdated. So that may have well dropped since then.
So I think it's probably dropped since then. But, I think what we see, and that is one good thing that's come out of the past 4 years, is there's a lot more interest in the process, people wanting to know how it works. And the political parties, we've always had laws in Wisconsin that allowed political parties to nominate poll workers. We didn't see them utilized really heavily until 2020. And that subsequent involvement has really lightened the load on recruiting election workers. But then there's also lots of great groups like Power to the Polls, or Power the Polls. I'm sorry, those are two very different groups. But Power the Polls really did a ton of digital advertising and helped nationwide recruit poll workers, especially younger populations in 2020, all the way up through 2024.
Claire, I wish we could talk for hours on this.
too.
So many questions. Unfortunately, we're really short on time. So we are going to take a break and have a parting thought on this right after the break. All right, we are back on Open Record. We're actually going to set aside our Off the Record segment this week. You won't get to tell us your favorite Halloween candy because we do want to address one more thing before we go, and this is a really important one, and that is in the current environment where there is so much going on social media. Election workers themselves have become, and election administrators have become the focus of a lot of not just observation, but criticism, even threats. Can you talk a little bit about your concerns there?
Yeah, I think that these are oftentimes highly underpaid jobs from people who are really committed to the process. I started working in elections in 2013, and I took such great pride that I wanted everyone's vote to count. Your election administrators, your poll workers are usually the most patriotic people you are going to encounter other than your veterans. They are wanting to make sure the system works. And so a lot of these conspiracy theories have been based on this idea that one person could change the outcome of an election, or that one city is corrupt and participating in all of these corrupt, fraudulent activities. And, as you get bold and you feel like you're so angry, I just caution everyone to please take a step back and think, your poll workers are oftentimes your neighbors, your school teachers. We have school teachers who take the day off to work the polls. They are members of your community, and to think that they would have gotten into working in the democracy sphere and not want it to work.
No!
All right. Nothing like this has happened in my 20 years at Fox 6 News. We were wrapping up the final minutes of the Open Record podcast, and just like that, the lights all went out. Pitch dark here in the digital studio. And so Claire Woodall, the former executive director of the Milwaukee Election Commission, was just there talking about threats to election workers and the increase in threats to those workers and administrators who are just trying to administer safe and secure elections, but are in an environment where things have become a little more troubling. She herself, I believe, was a target of some of those threats. By the time the power was restored, Claire was gone. So I'm going to wrap things up here and just say thank you to her for being here on Open Record this week. And thank you to Fox 6's Jason Calvi in a busy political season for taking his time to be on the podcast as well. We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll wrap things up right after this. And that is all the time we have this week here on Open Record. Once again, I want to thank Claire Woodall, the former executive director of the Milwaukee Election Commission, now with Issue 1, and Fox 6 political reporter Jason Calvi. If you have a topic you would like us to discuss on Open Record or an issue you think we should investigate for Fox 6 News, send us an email to fox6investigators@fox.com. As always, thank you to the people who make this podcast possible. That includes our executive producer, Sarah Smith, our editor, Dave Machuda, and our chief photographer, Cale Zimney. With that, I'm Bryan Polcyn. We'll be back next week.